Hi everyone, and thank you for sticking around. I know these conferences, they are very long. There's always a lot of things to hear about, a lot of people to talk to, so I really appreciate the time you're spending here with me. I hope you'll learn a couple of things, and I hope you'll have a good time. So my name is Henri Lieutaud. I work at the Starknet Foundation. I'm the head of ecosystem there. Starknet is a layer 2 on top of Ethereum. We're a validity rollup. And Argent has an amazing product, Argent X, that is deployed on Starknet. Check it out, it's cool. And today, I want to take a step aside from account abstraction. I know this is an account abstraction conference. And account abstraction is one of those weird topics where we keep talking about it. You've heard about it for years, but it has failed to materialize, in my opinion, substantially. I don't think the UX of blockchain has changed a lot in the past 2 to 3 years. And we tend to talk a lot about the technicality of account abstraction. And I want to start thinking about, okay, what can we actually do for users? We know account abstraction is amazing for users, but what can it do exactly? So I want to talk about 4 things, right? First, I want to talk about what it means to own something in the real world and in the digital world. I want to talk about identity, and I want to talk about how it relates, all of this relates to account abstraction, and finally, how can we create accounts that are based on identity on-chain rather than knowing some exotic secret, which is your seed phrase. So let's go. So first, let's talk about what ownership is, really. So, I'm going to talk a lot about bearer assets, so I'm going to define those, and bearer assets sounds a bit like beaver, so my whole presentation has beavers in it. So try to figure out the prompt. So first, let's talk about what a bearer asset is. A bearer asset is basically an asset you own by holding it in your hand, and if you pass it to somebody else's hand, then it belongs to them. It's one of the first and one of the oldest form of ownership. It is essentially something that there's no register for, you just own it by owning it, right? They were very common throughout society, and they've mostly disappeared in the past 30 to 40 years. There are still some, but they're not very common today. So they have some pros to them, right? So they're very easy to transfer. You just hold it to somebody else. They're P2P, so you can exchange it person to person without going through a third person. And they're anonymous. There's no trace of you exchanging something with somebody else. Now, they do have some cons also. They're really hard to insure because they're not attached to you, so it's hard to file a claim for it. At the end of the day, you have to defend them with physical violence, right? And that's not something most people are comfortable with. And in a lot of cases, there's little legal protection around the transfer of those assets. So that's for bearer assets. You hold it, you own it. Then the second type of assets is broadly registered assets. So registered assets are a bit different because ownership is not marked by holding some sort of token that shows ownership. It is marked by having your name in a register. So a company, for example, most companies have shares and they have a shareholder list, and whoever is on that list holds that asset. Those assets also are pretty old. They came up with the first civilization that had to, for example, mark the transfer of real estate, property right, and in the past 100 to 200 years or so, IP rights are a big part of that category also. And today, most assets you own are registered assets, meaning somebody is taking a note of who you are, and they're saying, yes, that person holds that asset. So they have a lot of pros to them. First of all, they're very widespread, and they're easy to reuse, right? They're easy to reuse in the sense that if you own a house, you can take a loan on it. Other people are willing to take that into account to lend you some money. They're easy to transfer in case of inheritance, and there's a lot of legal protection around them. They do have cons also, right? So there's no privacy on it because you have to have one person who knows what the content of those transfers are. they can be hard to transfer and they can be harder to compose. And I know this slide is a bit weird because it says, oh, you can reuse them, but then they're harder to compose. What gives? If it is a big kind of asset, right? If it's a house, something that is very widespread and well understood, then it's easy to compose with. But if it's a smaller asset, if you're a small company and you have stock, then it's much harder to compose. So you don't have this, like the reusability doesn't boil down to smaller units of assets, which is the case for bearer assets. Make sense so far? Good. All right, so in general, societies in the past 20 to 40 years have moved largely from bearer assets to registered assets. It used to be common to hold, treasure bonds that you could exchange for cash without you being registered elsewhere. Now it's much less so. And this transfer has actually been helped by the digitization process that our societies have been going through for the past 40 years. Think about it. Ownership on the internet doesn't really exist. Everything is a registered asset. So legally, we can say, no, but this is an asset you actually own. But in reality, somebody is holding that asset, and somebody has that name, your name, in a database that says, yes, this is what you own. So the digital world largely is a registered assets world, except for blockchain. In the world of blockchain, this is different. In the world of blockchain, you have bearer assets. You have an asset which you own by holding a private key. If you own your private key, you can hand your asset to anyone else without permission very easily, right? Now, this is great. The fact that we can do bearer assets in the digital world is a huge step forward. This is very new. But arguably, as I said before, most assets in the world today are registered assets. So if we want to bring more people on chain, if we want to deliver the value of blockchain to more people, we need registered assets on chain too. Now, why do I talk about this at an account abstraction conference? Because for the most part, all of you are aware that account abstraction is something that can help users. So the question is, how do we bake this into accounts and make accounts that are closer to what registered assets are than just bearer assets? How do we mesh both worlds? How can we on-chain identify a person and tie their identity to an account rather than having an account be purely a bearer asset? You own the private key or you don't, right? That's what I want to talk about today. And here we have to dive into another question, which is, what is you? What is identity, right? What defines a person? Turns out it's a weird question. I'm not going to go too much about it. But what defines a person is somebody else. Identity is a social construct that is delivered and maintained by external systems. This is not something, there's no perfect objective truth about who you are. All of it is externally defined by other people. And I'll give you some example. The first one is physical identity, right? Your body is a way to identify you, right? So you can use your iris, your fingerprints, a bunch of stuff. That's somewhat objective, but some people would argue that your body is changing, that your body is not the exact way to identify you. And also, this thing is really hard to digitize. It's really hard to represent online. It's really hard to represent in a computer. But it is fairly objective. The second kind of identity you'll get is a social identity, right? So, and that's probably the oldest form of identity you may have. So it's the ID that is being given to you by the people around you. You're the son or the daughter of somebody else. You're somebody else's brother. You're the friend to somebody, right? So defining your identity as your social circle is something that is very old and is very P2P also. It's really interesting. Then there's obviously government identity, right? I mean, if I ask you for your ID, the first thing you'll think about is, nice beaver, right? The first thing you'll think about is your ID card. So you'll pull out, hey, this is what my government says I am. It's important for all of those forms of identity to realize that they're not absolute and they're not perfect. Governments fail, body parts get lost, social security disappear. So none of them is perfect, but government identity is something that is fairly omnipresent, fairly interoperable around the world, right? Most passports can be recognized somewhere. But the issue is you can't really leverage them permissionlessly. You can't just ask somebody else for their ID and do something with it. In a lot of places, it's illegal. And then the last form of identity you'll get is your online identity. And here, your ID is your Reddit profile. It is your WoW character. It is what a website says, this is who you are, this is your historical data, this is what you've been doing. I'm sure who here uses Reddit? Okay, who attributes some value to the history of interaction and the karma they have on Reddit? A few of you, okay. So my point being that on the internet, your email address is some form of identity. And those websites are starting to realize this, right? They're starting to provide identity as a service, as a product on top of their other product. You can now sign in with Google on third-party websites, right? So they're starting to package this as a product. And they have very large user bases too. So now let's talk about having the ideal on-chain identity provider, right? What would we want to have for an identity provider on-chain? Well, first of all, it needs to be legitimate, right? All of those ID providers only work insofar that other people recognize that, yes, this is a legit form of identity. If somebody starts providing identity on-chain and you have a doubt whether those people are real humans or are spam, then it's hard. You're not going to use that ID provider. You need to have a proper process for key rotation. It needs to be possible for you to change your key and to change the ownership of your account based on who you are and not what key you hold. So that's also an important challenge. And then finally, it needs to be somewhat objective and non-centralized. You can't just rely on a single entity to provide identity on-chain. So it's probable that none of the other identity provider we mentioned before can provide that role. But can we get something by mixing and matching? So here I'm taking again a step back, and I'm going to mention that, I'm sorry, you're nerds. You're here at an account abstraction conference, and all we're talking about is the technicality of account abstraction. We've been trying to make better bearer assets for years, and there's probably a lot of work that can be done about bringing ID-based assets on-chain, and it would be good to go into that direction. The reason I think that bearer assets on-chain are not enough is that at the end of the day, the only thing that secures a bearer asset is the credible threat of physical violence. And I don't think that most people in the world would be comfortable with that. I actually probably think that nobody in this room is comfortable with that. I don't know, who has already thought about physically securing assets in the crypto world? You raise your hand? Yeah, you've given it some thought. Now, can you raise your hand if you're comfortable with that thought? Right. So, making my point, we can't be satisfied only with bearer assets. We need to have some kind of assets that go beyond that, and that is based on who you are and not just what you happen to hold at some point in time. I also want to mention that I'm not arguing for bearer asset to disappear. I'm just saying that what we're building here is something that enables people to tie into their identity without having to physically own something. You can't build bearer assets on the internet based on the current web because registered assets are what I call a soft system, right? It's human-based interaction, whereas bearer asset cryptography is a hard system. It's based on truth, it's based on mathematics. You can't build a hard system on top of a soft system, but you can build a soft system on top of a hard system. The main value of this is that you provide people with a way out if they need to at some point. If they need to escape from the soft system and if an ID provider abuses them, they can exit, get back to bearer assets, and move elsewhere. So let's talk about ID-based accounts. What can we imagine will happen? And these are just some reflection. There are much smarter people than me that have given it some thought. And if this is your case, I'd be happy to talk more about this. So the first thing is we do need ID providers on-chain. We do need the people who currently provide IDs on-chain to come on-chain, or we need to import what they're doing so that we can leverage it there. It's important because, first of all, if we want new users, we can't ask them to do everything anew. We need to leverage them where they are. We need to meet them where they are. And second, it's very unlikely that we're going to do a perfect system on the first try, so we might as well leverage what others are doing, figure out what they do well, figure out what they are doing wrong, and then we'll come up with new systems. There's a lot of stuff we can leverage from the real world. There's people trying to import physical characteristics on-chain. Modern ID cards, for example, the card of France, allow you to sign messages with it, so you can use, not everything is permissionless, but you can use some systems that exist in the real world to get people to sign messages on-chain and tie them to their identity. And then there's a lot of promises around zk-TLS, for example, that could allow you to, without asking Google, leverage the fact that somebody has a session with Google to derive some form of identity from them. There's probably a lot of innovation coming on that front, and a big question is also revolves around privacy, right? How much data do you really want on-chain? How can you provide a proof of identity without disclosing the identity on-chain? So there's going to be a lot of innovation on that front. The second thing I think is that we have an opportunity to redefine what identity is. Crypto has the opportunity to become another identity provider. And on that front, I think it's probably something, I'd be curious actually to talk with Gerald who's here and figure out if it's something they're thinking about at Argent. But when you think about social recovery for crypto wallets, for example, this is de facto an identity provider solution. This is importing a P2P network of human relationships on-chain and manifesting as a way to provide identity and to tie one wallet to one single person. So we get a way to define identity on-chain and be yet another identity provider. It's actually really interesting. There's a lot of really interesting things you can think of on how do you define identity and how do you bring it on-chain. Then the third thing that matters is that while all of this is nice, signing matters. Holding a key and being able to sign a message is still a big deal. You can't get away with purely non-ID, non-bearer assets ways, because you need, the main value of what we're building is providing people with a way out. People need to be able to go back to a bearer asset if they need. People need to know about key management, and people need to be able to sign messages and take ownership of their life back if they need to. And that's also my last point. Sovereignty matters. There are a lot of these challenges in designing accounts based on ID. There's a lot of challenges about bringing ID on chain. But the main value we're bringing here is self-sovereignty. It's about giving people a chance and an opportunity to stay in control of their accounts, regardless of who they are, regardless of the ID providers they want to use. They should be able to decide which ID provider they want to use, how they hierarchize them, how they reconcile in case of conflicts between two identity providers. And at the end of the day, this is what really matters. It's empowering the users and giving them the opportunity to define identity in a different way. And that's it for my presentation. I hope this was interesting. Can we make a quick show of hands? Who thought of something he had not thought before today? Okay, that's decent. Who had heard it all before? Okay, so we're fairly in the middle. I'm happy with that. Thank you for your time, and I don't know if there's time for a question, but feel free to do so if so. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned that some documentation in France lets you sign messages. How exactly does that work? Is it
so I'm not super familiar with this, so do double check what I'm saying. But the ID cards in France now have some secure element in it that once you pair them with your phone, allow you to authenticate yourself on official services in France. So you can, for example, connect with your tax account, you can connect with your social security account using your ID card and your phone. You can vote with your phone using your ID card now, which is pretty cool. It's fairly recent. It started in 2021, and it's not entirely permissionless. You can't build an application that leverages this, but there are standards around that, and this is apparently something that it will take a few years, but it's coming to a lot more ID systems. All right, thank you everyone. Hope you have a good conference. I'll see you soon.